He was the voice behind Superfly and People Get Ready, a musical genius worth $4 million at the time of his death, the equivalent of $7 million today. Curtis Mayfield shaped the soundtrack of the civil rights era, inspiring millions. But in a heartbreaking twist, he spent his final days in silence, paralyzed, and died alone in a forgotten, crumbling mansion. How did a man so powerful, so wealthy, end up abandoned by the world he once moved? This is the story of Curtis Mayfield's hidden downfall, his net worth, his lost legacy, and the haunting secrets inside his empty house. Before we dive into the heartbreaking tragedies of Curtis Mayfield's final years, stories that will not only shock you but truly break your heart, let's first take a step back. How did it all begin? How did a life so full of promise slowly spiral into so much pain? On June 3, 1942, in a small, damp apartment in Chicago's Cabrini Green, a newborn's faint cry broke through the noise of thin walls and muffled arguments. That child was Curtis Mayfield, tiny, just over 5.5 pounds, held close by his mother, Marion Washington, a woman with a strong will and a heart hardened by life's wounds. Cabrini Green was no place for childhood dreams. With its rundown buildings, gang-filled alleys, and the icy winds blowing off Lake Michigan, it was a neighborhood that tested survival every day. Before Curtis turned 1, he watched his father walk out into the cold and never return, leaving behind debt, silence, and shattered promises. Marion was left to raise 5 children on her own. She took on laundry work, odd jobs, anything that kept food on the table. She didn't cry or complain. She simply held her children close in the freezing nights, trying to protect them from the weight of despair. Poverty pressed in from all sides, but she wouldn't let it consume them. Curtis grew up in that chaos. Trash-strewn streets, the sound of gunfire, and a daily sense of fear became his reality. At just 5 years old, he saw his mother kneel before their landlord, pleading for more time to pay the rent. Her voice shook. Her eyes were filled with worry. That moment never left him. They moved from place to place, always a step behind the next overdue bill. One spring night in 1948, they packed what little they had and left once again. Amid the chaos, young Curtis clutched a pencil, scribbling music notes on scraps of paper. Music wasn't just a hobby. It was his lifeline, the one spark of peace in a world that never stopped pushing him down. It wasn't an escape. It was a fire inside him, one that refused to go out. In November 1949, at just 7 years old, Curtis walked into a small Baptist church where the scent of old wood hung in the air and an organ hummed gently in the background. When he joined the choir, his voice, pure and clear, rose above the others and brought the room to a hush. Some in the congregation even wiped away tears. In that moment, Curtis knew he was meant to sing. Back home, he spent hours with an old, rusty-stringed guitar a neighbor had given him. The notes were rough at first, but they were full of heart. He told himself that one day, through music, he'd lift his family out of Cabrini Green and give them the life they deserved. But the road ahead wasn't nearly as simple or kind as he hoped. One freezing night in December 1954, Curtis was walking home from church after helping prepare for Christmas. He held a loaf of bread his mother had wrapped for dinner, skipping along the sidewalk. Out of nowhere, a group of teens stepped into his path. Their eyes were cold, demanding money. Curtis had none, just the bread. They beat him quickly and viciously, leaving him curled up on the pavement, bruised and barely conscious. No one knew it at the time, but that violent moment would inspire his very first song, a gospel piece he wrote about finding light even in life's darkest corners. Then in June 1956, a new chapter began. Curtis joined a group called the Roosters, later renamed the Impressions, alongside Jerry Butler and a few friends from Cabrini Green. They sang in local churches, performing for tired mothers and elders seeking comfort. But Curtis's voice stood out. His tenor soared, and his guitar, rooted in gospel and blues, carried a raw, emotional depth. When he sang, it felt like he was telling the story of their neighborhood, of their pain, and it moved people to tears. Around this time, a little light broke through the haze of Curtis's hard life. In the alleys filled with coal smoke, where children's laughter tangled with the blare of car horns, he met Helen, the first woman to truly capture his heart. She was gentle, with deep, kind eyes, and a smile that made the struggling young musician feel like, for once, the world wasn't so heavy. They fell in love just as Curtis was beginning to find his way with the Impressions. He was still a backup singer behind Jerry Butler, with fame just a distant hope. But being with Helen gave him something real, something grounding. As the Impressions gained momentum, Curtis believed he could finally offer Helen the life she deserved. They married in a small, modest ceremony at a Chicago church, surrounded by close friends and family. Their early married life played out in a cramped apartment where Curtis's guitar filled the quiet nights, mingling with the soft cries of their two children, born back to back. Helen managed the home while Curtis threw himself into his music, chasing a dream that still felt just out of reach. But life in music isn't all applause and bright lights. In March 1957, the Impressions were performing at a rough West Side bar, thick with cigarette smoke and the rowdy shouts of a half-drunk crowd. Mid-song, Curtis spotted a glass flying toward him. It shattered at his feet, shards scattering across the stage. He froze for a split second, locking eyes with the man who threw it, then picked up right where he left off, singing even stronger. After the show, Jerry Butler slapped him on the shoulder and told him he had the makings of a true warrior. The words filled Curtis with pride. But that moment also marked a turning point. Quiet tensions within the group began to grow, and they wouldn't stay quiet for long. By May 1958, the Impressions had recorded For Your Precious Love, a song that blended Curtis's soulful lyrics with themes of deep emotion and quiet pride in the face of racial injustice. It was more than just a love song. It was a quiet revolution. Hearing it on the radio or playing in corner stores filled Curtis with pride. His heart raced every time. For a moment, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. But that moment didn't last. In late March 1960, Jerry Butler announced he was leaving the group to pursue a solo career, leaving 17-year-old Curtis to step up as the leader. The news hit hard. Curtis felt the ground shift beneath him. Still, this didn't come out of nowhere. The tension had been building for some time. Back in late 1959, during a quiet conversation at a Southside cafe, Jerry had hinted that Curtis was taking too much control, from the songwriting to the overall direction of the group. And there were whispers behind Curtis's back. He could feel it. Deep down, he knew Jerry was also frustrated with how money was being split. Things came to a head one night that December when Jerry refused to perform, saying he was exhausted. Curtis had to go out and face the crowd alone. From that point, things started to crack. Not loudly, but like glass under pressure. Subtle glances, quiet disagreements, and distance between members that never quite healed. When Jerry officially walked away, Curtis was under immense pressure. He tried to keep things together, and publicly, they kept it civil. But the friendship was gone. Fans picked up on the shift. Interviews felt colder, less connected. The chemistry had changed. Still, Curtis pushed forward. He led the group through the next 5 years, delivering music that mattered. But the cost was high. Financial strain and the weight of responsibility took him away from home for long stretches. And though Helen remained supportive, the loneliness took a toll. Fame had its pull, and Curtis wasn't immune to temptation. The long nights, the travel, the adoration, it all chipped away at what he and Helen once had. When he did return home, something had changed. The silence between them grew louder. Helen likely saw it in his eyes. that the man who once promised her the world was drifting further away. Their marriage ended quietly sometime in the mid-1960s, just before Curtis truly became a star. By August 1965, Curtis Mayfield was facing a new kind of challenge. At just 23, in the heavy heat of a Chicago summer, he wasn't sweating from exhaustion, but from the weight of something much bigger. He had just finished recording People Get Ready, a song that felt like a spiritual anthem for the civil rights movement. Curtis felt it in his bones. He had delivered something important, something that spoke to the soul of a generation. And the song caught on fast, spreading from church pews in Harlem to the dusty streets of Birmingham. But fame, especially for a black man speaking truth, came with shadows. Just days after the song's release, a letter arrived from an Alabama radio station, flatly refusing to play it. The reason? It was inciting unrest. Other Southern stations followed suit, and soon whispers began to reach Curtis. Rumors that the FBI had started watching him, placing him on a list of so-called troublemakers for daring to sing about justice. The pressure wasn't just coming from outside. In January 1966, while having dinner with producer Johnny Pate, a colleague pulled Curtis aside and warned him not to get political. "Stick to love songs," the man said. "That's what sells. That's what's safe." But Curtis couldn't stay silent. Instead, he went home and wrote, "We're a winner." When it was released in March 1967, it was a bold, proud declaration. The lyrics didn't ask for approval. They claimed it. Black Americans weren't just surviving. They were rising. And Curtis sang it with fire, his voice full of pride, daring anyone to challenge the truth behind his words. The world, however, rarely gives in easily to dreams. In June 1968, inside a small, crowded Chicago studio, Curtis and the Impressions recorded "This Is My Country," a defiant statement of black belonging. It was raw, honest, and powerful. But when they sent the track out, an executive from ABC Records called with a warning: the song might upset white listeners and hurt the group's career. Curtis didn't hesitate. He responded calmly, but with conviction. "If they don't like it, that's their problem, not mine." That decision lit a fire, and not everyone stood by him. Some of Curtis's colleagues began to pull away. Quiet conversations turned into whispers that he was becoming too bold, too arrogant, too willing to take risks. But Curtis wasn't standing alone. Artists like Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder were also stepping into socially conscious music, and their paths gave him strength. In September 1968, on a crisp fall morning in Harlem, Curtis stepped onto the stage and performed "This Is My Country" in front of a proud black audience. Their eyes lit up with emotion, pride, hope, recognition. But further south, the reaction was anything but uplifting. Threatening letters began pouring in. Some called him a traitor. One letter, written in red ink and sent to the Impressions office, promised that Curtis would pay dearly if he kept going down this road. Still, Curtis didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down. At the end of 1968, he made a bold move. He founded Curtom Records, his own label. It was more than a business venture. It was his dream, to own his work, to have full creative freedom, and to answer to no one. But the dream quickly ran into harsh reality. One evening in July 1969, while sitting in Curtom's modest office, Curtis learned that a distributor had embezzled a significant chunk of the label's revenue. Just like that, Curtom was in serious debt. Curtis had to borrow money just to keep his staff paid, and the problems didn't stop there. In January 1970, the Staple Singers, who had signed with Curtom, voiced their frustrations. Mavis Staples was especially vocal, accusing Curtis of prioritizing his solo projects and neglecting their album, Let's Do It Again. Curtis tried to reassure her, promising he'd invest more into the project. But the truth was, the label's budget was tight. The competition in the music industry was getting tougher, and it didn't help that Motown was hitting its stride. In February 1970, at an industry event in New York, Curtis overheard that Motown was pouring major resources into promoting Marvin Gaye. Meanwhile, his own label, Curtom, was still struggling to get reliable distribution. At a party that night, a Motown producer took a cheap shot, laughing that Curtis thought he could compete with just a few political songs. The comment stung, but Curtis didn't flinch. He went back to the studio and threw himself into what would become Superfly, the album he hoped would change everything. But the pressure didn't let up. Just a week later, Curtis got a letter from the bank warning that Curtom's assets were on the verge of being seized over unpaid debts. That moment forced him to take a hard look at everything he'd built and to ask himself whether the dream of independence was worth what it was costing him. In March 1970, he made a decision that would change his life. He left the Impressions. When he told Fred Cash and Sam Gooden, the room went quiet. The weight of the moment was heavy, as if all the air had been sucked out. Sam, voice low and hurt, asked if Curtis was really leaving them for Curtom and his solo ambitions. Curtis tried to explain. It wasn't about leaving them behind, it was about finally having creative freedom. But Fred's cold stare said it all. To him, Curtis was walking away from the family they had built together. The split turned messy. Arguments broke out over royalties and rights to the old hits. Fred and Sam felt like Curtis had taken more than his share, as if he'd claimed ownership over songs born from all of them. The meeting ended in silence. And from that day on, they rarely looked each other in the eye. Even the fans were divided. Some stood with Curtis, believing in his vision. Others said he had betrayed the Impressions, the very group that gave him his start. The criticism hurt, deeply. But Curtis didn't back down. He stayed the course, knowing that some dreams come with a heavy price. In September 1970, when Move On Up hit the airwaves, Curtis felt a powerful sense of validation. His bold new direction was working, and for a moment, it felt like the risk had paid off. But even with success ringing from every radio, a quiet emptiness remained. As he wrote, "We people who are darker than blue," the highs and lows in the music mirrored something deeper, the ache of a man who had found freedom, but at the cost of brotherhood. During this time, as Curtis became a rising icon in Chicago's soul scene, he met Althea, known simply as Altha. She wasn't just beautiful, with a fierce presence and warm spirit. She was unwavering, a steady force in a world that often pulled Curtis in every direction. They married in the early 1970s, right as Curtis was stepping away from the Impressions to fully commit to his solo career and the launch of Curtom Records, his vision of artistic independence. Their life together began in a modest Chicago home, filled with the sound of Curtis's guitar, the energy of demo tapes, and the laughter of 6 children growing up surrounded by music. Altha wasn't just his wife, she was his anchor. While Curtis disappeared into studios or took off on tour, she kept their world together. She handled the daily chaos, the quiet details he often overlooked, and made sure their home remained a place of warmth and stability, even as his fame took him far from it. But their marriage, like any built in the spotlight, had its struggles. Curtis may have been a musical genius, but he wasn't a perfect husband. The pressure of fame and the demands of the industry sometimes pulled him off course, leading to moments of infidelity. And in rare, painful instances, tension boiled over into domestic violence, brief lapses that left emotional scars neither of them could forget. Still, Altha stayed, not just for the children, but because she believed in the man beneath the fame, the man who wrote songs that stirred the soul, who had once promised her a better life. She held on to hope, on to love, and helped carry the weight of his growing success. Throughout the next decade, Curtis's career climbed. In 1980, the family packed up their lives in Chicago, and moved to Atlanta, where Curtom Records was relocating. It was Altha who managed the transition, organizing the move, guiding the kids through the change, and trying to build something stable in a new city. Atlanta offered a clean slate, a chance to start fresh. But fate had other plans. In May 1987, during a recording session back in Chicago, Curtis collapsed mid-song. His vision blurred, sweat poured down his face, and his guitar fell from his hands with a crash. The musicians around him rushed to help, alarmed, but Curtis tried to play it off with a shaky smile, insisting he just needed a break. The truth was far more serious. A hospital visit revealed the diagnosis: type 2 diabetes, a condition that had been silently attacking his body for years. The disease had already taken a toll, leaving him drained, sometimes too weak to even stand for half an hour. And this was just the beginning. Lying in his hospital bed, staring out the window, Curtis couldn't shake the feeling that fate had taken something from him, something deep, something vital. But he kept those fears to himself. Only Altha saw through the silence. To her, in a quiet moment, he made a simple promise. He wouldn't let the disease win. But diabetes was relentless. One night in July 1988, while performing at a small club in Detroit, Curtis began to feel lightheaded. Mid-song, he grew dizzy and slowly lowered himself onto the stage floor, pretending it was part of the show. The audience kept swaying to the music, unaware. But from the wings, Altha watched with tears in her eyes, knowing exactly what was happening. He was struggling, badly. Curtis refused to let the public see his pain. He didn't want sympathy, but his body was starting to turn against him. Then, one morning in January 1990, while eating breakfast at home in Atlanta, he suddenly lost all feeling in his left hand. His plate slipped from his grasp and shattered on the floor. The doctor's words came like a blow. His diabetes was attacking his nerves, and if it kept progressing, he might lose the ability to play guitar altogether. For Curtis, that meant losing a piece of who he was. Gripped by fear, he turned to Altha, took her hand, and said he would fight. But in his heart, he knew the road ahead would be long and cruel. And on August 13th, 1990, the sky over Brooklyn was dark and restless. Winds swept through Wingate Field, howling like a warning. Curtis Mayfield, 48 years old, was getting ready to perform at an outdoor festival. By 5 p.m., the wind had picked up sharply. Dust spun through the air. Leaves flew across the stage, and the heavy metal lighting rig groaned under the pressure. Despite growing concerns and weather warnings, the show went on. 10,000 tickets had been sold, and the organizers refused to cancel. Curtis, clearly uneasy about the shifting rig above him, stepped onto the stage at 7:05 p.m., flashing that familiar smile, his guitar slung over his shoulder. The crowd cheered, unaware that tragedy was only moments away. As Curtis strummed the opening notes of People Get Ready, a violent gust, nearly 60 kilometers per hour, ripped through the field. Then came a crack, loud and terrifying. The massive 1,000-pound lighting rig gave way and came crashing down. Screams filled the air as chaos erupted. Just 10 meters away, Altha saw it happen. She bolted forward, shouting his name, but the noise swallowed her voice. On the ground, Curtis lay pinned beneath the metal, his guitar shattered beside him, its broken strings spread like open wounds. It took rescuers 15 agonizing minutes to lift the rig. Every second felt like an eternity for Altha, who watched helplessly, her heart breaking as the man she loved lay motionless in the wreckage. Curtis was rushed to Kings County Hospital in critical condition, surrounded by the frantic beeping of machines. The next day, August 14th, 1990, a doctor, pale and solemn, delivered the devastating news. Curtis had suffered 3 broken cervical vertebrae and severe spinal cord damage. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He would never move again, never play guitar, never even breathe without assistance. Altha collapsed in tears, her world shattered in an instant. The weeks that followed were a blur of sterile hospital rooms and unbearable stillness. Curtis lay immobile, his body unresponsive, only his eyes burning with silent pain. Each night he stared out the window and whispered to Altha that he couldn't live like this. His words broke her heart over and over. His diabetes made everything worse. Recovery was slow and uncertain. Infections took hold. Fevers surged through his helpless body. On October 3, 1990, he struggled to breathe, his chest tight, his lungs failing. Nurses rushed in, machines screaming as Altha cried out, helpless. He pulled through. But each day became a battle, and every small victory was hard won. Still, Curtis refused to give up. On November 15, 1990, he asked Altha to bring a microphone to his bedside. Flat on his back, lungs weak and aching, he sang in short bursts. Every note was an act of defiance, a quiet, painful declaration that his spirit wasn't broken. The accident had taken his body, but not his voice. Not yet. But the crash didn't just paralyze Curtis, it nearly destroyed everything around him. Curtom Records, already under financial strain, finally folded in March 1991. The debt was too much to bear. A month later, on April 10th, Altha opened a bill for $75,000 in medical costs. They had barely a few $1,000s left. Desperate, she sold the family's last car, the one thing they'd always relied on during the hard times. Curtis's 6 children, ranging from teenagers to young adults, watched as their mother pushed herself to the edge. Altha worked 16-hour days, taking cleaning jobs, selling whatever she could, doing everything in her power just to keep the family afloat. Tensions eventually boiled over. On July 18, 1992, in their modest Atlanta home, a fierce argument broke out between Altha and their eldest son, Todd. The topic: whether to sell the rights to Superfly to cover mounting debts. Todd exploded, insisting it was sacred, his father's masterpiece, untouchable. Just a few feet away, Curtis lay in his medical bed, unable to speak, but listening. After the shouting faded, he reached for Altha's hand. His eyes were red, filled with pain, not just physical, but emotional. He couldn't say it, but everything in his expression seemed to whisper, "I'm sorry I couldn't protect us." The weight of financial stress was cracking the foundation of the family. Then, on October 5, 1993, things reached a breaking point. After a heated argument with her siblings, their 15-year-old daughter ran away. She yelled that her father wasn't the man he used to be, that their family was falling apart. Altha found her 3 days later, curled up alone in a park. She brought her home, but the emotional damage was already done. Curtis heard what had happened. He didn't say a word, just stared up at the ceiling, silent tears rolling down his cheeks. The depression deepened. Charity concerts, like one held in Chicago on August 20th, 1994, tried to ease the burden. They raised some money, but in the face of everything the family was facing, it felt like a drop in the desert. On February 12, 1996, Curtis received yet another blow. From his home in Roswell, Georgia, he learned that a former Curtom Records partner had embezzled $20,000 from the Superfly royalties. It wasn't just about the money. It was about betrayal, another crack in an already wounded heart. 2 years earlier, in February 1994, the Los Angeles Grammy Awards paid tribute to Curtis Mayfield. People Get Ready was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, and he was honored with the prestigious Legend Award. But at 51, Curtis could only watch the ceremony on a grainy television from his hospital bed. Paralyzed and frail, he couldn't stand to receive the applause, but his eyes told the story. They sparkled with pride, and just beneath that, deep pain. Altha sat beside him, quietly holding his hand, holding back her own tears as the entire audience stood in his honor. Even as his body continued to fail him, Curtis made a promise to himself. He would make one last album. New World Order would be his final gift to the world. On June 15, 1995, in a makeshift studio set up in his bedroom, Curtis lay flat on a medical bed, a microphone just inches from his mouth. Diabetes and weak lungs meant he could only sing in short bursts, just a few lines at a time, before he had to gasp for air through an oxygen tube. On August 10th, after a particularly painful take, Curtis broke down in tears. The effort, the pain, the limits. It felt like too much. He wept, feeling like the very essence of who he was had slipped away. Altha knelt beside him, gently wiped away his tears, and whispered softly, "The world still needs your voice." And with that, Curtis kept going. Then, just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, another tragedy struck. On July 15th, 1995, with New World Order still unfinished, a fire broke out in the basement of the Mayfield home in Roswell. Faulty wiring, part of ongoing renovations for Curtis's music archives, sparked the blaze. Within minutes, flames swept through boxes of handwritten lyrics, destroying dozens of unreleased songs, some dating back to his early days with the Impressions. Upstairs, Altha saw the smoke and screamed, frantically dialing for help. Curtis, unable to move, could only lie there as the smell of burning filled the air. He heard glass shatter. He felt the heat creeping closer. And all he could do was cry, tears rolling down as he imagined the work, the memories, the music gone forever. Firefighters arrived and eventually got the flames under control. The house survived, but the basement and Curtis's precious archives were reduced to ash. Something inside him burned with it. The loss deepened his already heavy depression. Still, he pushed through. After hundreds of agonizing hours, New World Order was finally complete in March 1996. On April 5th, Curtis listened to the final mix. He managed a faint smile, a quiet moment of peace, but it didn't last. Days later, a sudden fever from an infection overwhelmed his weakened body. He passed out and had to be rushed in for emergency care. At home, every note of New World Order was a battle. Curtis may have lost control of his body, but to his family he was still a hero, fighting with everything he had left. By April 1996, the Roswell home where he spent his final years no longer felt like a refuge. The white walls were stained with time, and the once lively oak-filled backyard had grown quiet. Curtis's bedroom had become a full-time hospital room, his final battlefield, complete with a ventilator and medical bed. New World Order was born out of pain and perseverance. It was proof that Curtis hadn't given up, even as his body, ravaged by diabetes and a decade of paralysis, grew weaker by the day. On May 10, 1996, Altha wheeled him out into the backyard. The breeze was soft, the sky overcast. Curtis looked up, his eyes tired but searching. Then, in a faint voice, he asked to hear, "People Get Ready." Altha played the cassette. As the opening notes floated through the air, Curtis closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he wasn't in a wheelchair. He was back on stage at the Apollo Theater in 1970, with the crowd roaring his name. But by the end of 1999, his health had taken a sharp decline. Years of diabetes had ravaged his nerves and destroyed his immune system. The paralysis made him vulnerable to constant infections. His body covered in sores that never healed, his lungs growing weaker by the day. On December 8, 1999, in Roswell, Curtis developed a high fever, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and began struggling to breathe. Altha knew something was wrong. Without hesitation, she called for an ambulance. Within minutes, Curtis was rushed to North Fulton Regional Hospital and taken to the ICU. Surrounded by tubes and machines, his frail 95-pound body lay still, pale, weak, and covered in unhealing sores. The heart monitor kept a steady rhythm, but every breath came with effort. Altha stayed close along with their children, Todd, Sharon, and Tracy. They held each other's hands, trying to stay strong, fighting back tears. Curtis was still conscious, though too weak to speak. His eyes met theirs, filled with love and quiet sorrow. It was a goodbye he couldn't say out loud. By December 23rd, he slipped into a semi-conscious state. On Christmas morning, his heart began to slow. The ventilator hissed and strained, trying to keep him alive. At 7:22 a.m. on December 26, 1999, the monitor went silent. Curtis Mayfield was gone, his body finally giving out from multi-organ failure caused by sepsis, respiratory failure, and the years of damage inflicted by diabetes and paralysis. Altha collapsed onto his bed, clutching his body as sobs racked her frame. Sharon screamed his name, her voice breaking with grief, as if somehow, through sheer love and desperation, she could call him back. News of Curtis Mayfield's death spread quickly. That same evening, an Atlanta radio station paused its regular programming and played "We're a Winner" and "Move On" up on repeat. Across the country, people who had grown up with his music turned on their radios, many with tears streaming down their faces. The voice that had once lifted a generation was gone. But for his family, the heartbreak didn't end there. In May 2000, Altha made a devastating discovery. Former business partners had quietly siphoned off a significant portion of the Superfly revenue. Curtom Records, Curtis's dream, his legacy, had been nearly drained behind their backs. By April 2001, overwhelmed by debt and with mouths still to feed, Altha made the painful decision to sell the Roswell home. It was the house where Curtis had spent his final years, where music and memories filled every corner. Before they left, the family felt something, like Curtis had never really left. On quiet nights, Altha would sometimes catch a presence near the window of what had once been his hospital room. A stillness, a feeling, as if he were standing there, watching. Once, while cleaning the living room, the lights flickered without cause. She stopped, scanned the darkened space, and felt her chest tighten. She didn't need proof. She knew. Curtis was still there. In spirit, in memory, in everything that remained. His children felt it too. Todd, Sharon, and Tracy sometimes heard faint strums of guitar late at night, like a soft melody carried on the wind. On one rainy evening, Tracy swore she felt a breeze touch her shoulder and heard a quiet laugh behind her, like Curtis was there, still watching over them. They didn't talk about these moments, they didn't need to. Deep down, they all understood. His spirit was still in that house, solid and unshakable, just like his music, just like his love, never fading. In 2003, the family's heartache deepened once more. They discovered that Marv Heyman, Curtis's longtime manager and someone they had trusted for years, had embezzled millions in royalties. Altha, determined to protect what remained of Curtis's legacy, filed a lawsuit demanding Heyman's removal from the family trust. The betrayal ran deep. Heyman had sold the rights to Superfly for $54 million, yet each of Curtis's children received just $65,000. He took a $540,000 commission for himself, along with hundreds of thousands more in so-called office fees. At one point, he even threatened to cut off Altha's quarterly income. The legal battle dragged on, reopening wounds that had never truly healed. Curtis Mayfield's legacy, immortal through powerful works like Superfly and People Get Ready, was clouded by years of disputes, financial ruin, and profound grief. Yet beyond the courtroom drama, fans continued to honor him. At a memorial concert in Chicago on July 15, 2000, a young Kanye West, still an up-and-coming producer, fought back tears as he told the crowd that Curtis taught him music could be a tool for change. In the years that followed, artists like Jay-Z and Alicia Keys would pay tribute by weaving "People Get Ready" into their own music, keeping Curtis's message alive. But for his family, the pain lingers. The Roswell house, once filled with Curtis's music and the voices of his children, is no longer theirs. Though its white walls have faded to yellow, in their memories it still echoes with the sound of Curtis sitting by the window, gazing at the trees, listening to birdsong to ease his pain. Now that home stands quiet, a space filled with memories that won't let go, a place haunted not just by loss, but by love. What part of Curtis's journey impacted you the most? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want more powerful stories like this one, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into music's untold stories like this. Until next time, stay tuned.